Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and today we're going to be doing an educational follow up to Lita's survivor story. And in this follow up, we are going to break down the core themes of Lita's story, the fear, obligation, guilt, and shame that shaped the relationship, an analogy that explains how Lita's ex's trauma became tools of control, and what the healing might look like after you have gone through this, after Lita went through this. But before we get into that, if you want to be a guest like Lita was on our Survivor Story episode, you can go to narcissistapocalypse.com, click on the guest form button at the top of the page, or email us at narcissistapocalypse@pm.me. And we also have a free newsletter, and each week it includes 5 insights related to the Survivor Story episode, a reflection worksheet, which is a downloadable worksheet from our newsletter, and you can sign up on the front page of our website or through the link in today's show notes, and it is all free. So for those of you that have not listened to that episode yet, Lita's episode, I'm going to give some context to you if you have not listened to that episode. And Lita shared her story of a relationship that escalated from emotional manipulation into severe psychological abuse and repeated physical violence. And Lita grew up in an environment where emotional support was inconsistent and problems were often met with blame, and her mom did not protect her at all and blamed her for everything. And she wasn't getting help from anyone, and she was on her own just to figure everything out. And over time, she became someone who believed deeply in accountability and self-reflection. What did I do wrong? Or what was my part in it? That was part of her thinking. And when she met the man who would become the abuser in her life, this accountability that she had, this self reflection that she had, combined with a lot of kernels of truth and blame from the abuser, would help keep Lita in the abuse, in this course of control for a long time. He manipulated her belief system, and at that point, she had all of her worth in his hands, and he became a puppet master. He praised her resilience early on. He told her how strong she was, and this was huge for Lita, and it was how she was seen. For the first time in her life, she really felt deeply seen after that happened, and that validation eventually became the foundation of control. And as the relationship progressed, the abuse escalated into intimidation with firearms, threats of suicide, financial exploitation, destruction of property, severe physical violence. And throughout the relationship, the abusive behaviors were repeatedly framed as a result of PTSD and his traumatic brain injury, TBI. These were the causes of the emotional instability. And those explanations kept Lita focused on helping him heal rather than protecting herself. So it was a double whammy right there, thinking things are her fault, but then also these excuses that are built in on his end. And she's very understanding of that. And eventually that all came crashing down in Lita's illusion of who this person disappeared. And because of that, Lita then had the ability to see things and then leave the relationship for good. Key themes in Lita's story, and we're going to be hammering things home here. Being seen for the first time. The abuser quickly identified the deepest emotional wound in Lita's life, the feeling that no one had ever truly recognized her strength. And he validated that part of her immediately. And for someone that spent their life feeling blamed and overlooked, that kind of recognition can feel transformative. And for Lita, that was a big thing, and it was a big part of the trauma bond. And next we have weaponized self-reflection. And Lita had spent years working on herself emotionally, and she really believed in taking accountability. She believed in the growth of that. Normally, that is healthy. But in abusive relationships, this is where this self-reflection can then become weaponized by the abuser. And every accusation becomes something that the survivor and Lita felt obligated to examine and even when it wasn't true at all. And that was a big trick here, weaponizing this self-reflection against Lita, and it kept her in the relationship longer. And another theme is weaponized trauma narratives. And the abuser in this story frequently explained his behavior through PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and these explanations contained kernels of truth because trauma is real. Mental health struggles are real. This person was in the armed forces, but those truths were used in a way that removed accountability for the person that was perpetrating these crimes against Lita. And this allowed the abuse to continue further. So those are our key themes for Lita's story. And an analogy for Lita's story, imagine you've spent your whole life wanting to build the perfect house. You have a vision for it, but no one else really sees it. No one understands what you're trying to build. Then one day, someone comes along and says, I see it. I see the house you're trying to build. And that feeling is an incredible feeling because for the first time, someone understands your vision. And they say something even better. I want to build this house with you and for you. So the two of you begin building. And like any real structure, the most important work happens underground, the building of the foundation. Stone by stone, that foundation is laid carefully, deliberately, making sure everything that will sit on top of it has something solid to stand on. But instead of stone, this foundation is built with explanations. A little bit of truth here, a believable story there, a reason why certain things might happen, warnings about storms that might come. Some of those things are real. Storms do exist. The ground can really shake. And because those things are true, every explanation feels reasonable. And over time, those explanations become the foundation of the entire structure. So when the walls eventually rise, when the shouting begins, when the chaos appears, it all seems to belong there because the structure that holds it up was built long before the damage showed up. Every crack in the walls already has an explanation. The storm caused it. The ground shifted. The damage was unavoidable. And if you question it, you're told you don't understand how building works. And you believe that because some of what they say is true. Storms do exist. The ground can shake. So now you're living in the house you always dreamed of, except slowly you begin to notice something strange. The house you imagined had sunlight and open windows, but this house has no windows. The doors lock from both sides. There are cameras watching every room. This wasn't a house. It was a fortress, and it wasn't built to protect you. It was built to keep you inside. You don't see it at first because you're living inside of it, but eventually something happens that reveals the truth. You notice that storms only hit one side of the house. The ground only shakes when no one else is around. And whenever other people show up, everything suddenly becomes calm again. And that's when the realization begins. This house was never the dream you were building. It was a hiding place someone else was constructing. One built carefully enough that everything happening inside would always have somewhere to hide. And in Lita's story, something very similar to this happened. And I'm sure in your stories, something like this happened as well. And that brings us to selective rage and accountability, where there are several moments in Lita's story that reveal something very important. When he injured her pretty badly, enough to create visible evidence, his rage stopped instantly. When she gained independence through work, money, or outside support, the explosions became more severe. Those patterns suggest that the rage was not uncontrollable. It was situational. It disappeared when consequences were possible. And so it doesn't mean that the trauma wasn't real, but it does mean that someone who has this trauma that they said they have, which was a real trauma, is still choosing abusive behavior. And so these two things can exist at the same time, that someone does have these issues, but they are choosing to be abusive. And based upon Lita's story, you can see that pretty clearly. And up next, we have the fog: fear, obligation, guilt, and we include shame in the fogs. So the fogs. And for fear, we have fear of explosive violence. And Lita was living with someone whose reaction could turn physical very quickly. What made that especially destabilizing was not just the violence itself, but the unpredictability of it. The escalation did not always follow a clear pattern. It could come out of something very small and ordinary, and that kind of unpredictability trains your nervous system into really a constant vigilance, and you stop living normally and really just start scanning for things. What could set someone off? And over time, fear stops being just a response to violence. It really becomes, the environment that you live inside, and it's part of controlling everything and you. And next up, we have fear of the firearms, fear created by the firearms. And this is a genuine fear. Guns were present in moments of conflict, shots were fired in the house, a pistol was used as intimidation, and that changes the reality, the emotional reality of the relationship. And when you're in this type of abuse, and this is a huge fear, you're really in survival mode, and it's used to control you within the relationship, the fear of even leaving the relationship, of what might happen. So it's a real big fear that keeps you under coercive control. And next, we have fear of suicide threats. And in many cases, the more she tried to make herself independent, the threat of self-harm or suicide retaliation entered the picture, and that's a big form of control, coercive control, and that makes leaving feel difficult. It brings in obligation, it brings in guilt. This one right here, it's not just a fear, it brings in all of these other things, and it's meant to keep you in line, keep you in the relationship, and keep you under control. And up next, the fear of surveillance or being watched. And early on in this relationship, the abuser, Lita's abuser, talked about intelligence gathering, surveillance, hidden cameras, how they manipulate people, all that kind of stuff, that information. And whether it was true or not, the effect was pretty big, that she's going to be watched everywhere she's going. So there's a fear of doing something wrong. All of a sudden, you're making sure that you're not doing anything wrong. You're overcorrecting yourself. It is a huge form of control, and your privacy is gone, your autonomy is gone, and it's done a really good job when these things were mentioned. And a bit of an overlap here would be obligation, because you're just more careful, and you're more compliant. You're self-policing. And then another fear is the fear of Lita's own judgment being wrong, and it's a huge part of the coercive control system. We heard earlier on how she was self-reflecting and was really looking to see if she's part of the problem, and that was used as a weapon. And the fear of being wrong creates a control system, and it's destabilizing. It's hard to figure out what is going on, and it's a form of control because you are now doubting things, and you're doubting yourself. And part of this can be an overlap with guilt. If you're wrong, about what's going on, you feel guilty if you're wrong, that you've done the other person harm. So this is, again, a big part of coercive control. And next up, we have obligations. And obligation, our first one on the list, is obligation to be the one who understands. So in this story, Lita was really understanding towards the brain injury, to the PTSD, and in a big way she felt obligated to not just be this person's partner, but she understood him and understood that, like, to give him grace for these things. She felt obligated to give him grace for all of these things when he's not taking responsibility, because he has this PTSD, and it really helps create course of, and it really helps control her in the situation. And there's an overlap here where there's guilt, and guilt towards someone who has these things, because leaving feels like you're disappointing them. So it's going to keep you in the relationship longer. And then there's also shame involved in this one, because if Lita can't help, maybe she's not as insightful as she thought she was, or maybe she's not as compassionate as she thought she was. So there's shame involved here as well. And another obligation here is it's pretty tightly, it's pretty close to the one before. Obligation to help heal him, everything that's going on with the PTSD, the psychedelic treatments that he's going on. She's very understanding of him going with the counseling, all these things that are going on, and she's doing her best to be a helpful partner. So that is keeping her here, the obligation to be that person for him. And an overlap here is fear, if I do not help him, that he could become more dangerous. And then there's the obligation from the sunk cost fallacy, where there is so much time put into this relationship and so much energy put into this relationship, money, identity. She uprooted herself. There's a lot going on here in the sunk cost aspect of things. There's an obligation to staying because of how much you put into this relationship. And shame can also be an overlap here. Admitting that everything was for naught can be a big thing to keep someone in this relationship. It can be humiliating for a lot of people. So that's a big one that Lita had to deal with, and so many of you have to deal with as well. And up next, we have different types of guilt. Guilt for triggering him, where his trauma explanations made her reactions to things seem like they were provocations to things. So if he exploded, it was because she pushed him too hard and questioned him unfairly and didn't understand everything that he was dealing with. And it's quite a manipulation that was used, that uses guilt here in the way that Lita is. Guilt for triggering him, so she thinks it's her fault to begin with, which keeps the control going. And then, guilt for not being compassionate enough. He had a lot of maybe true parts of the story, the trauma, the military experiences, the injuries, and mental health struggles. So again, feeling guilty for everything that he has to go through, what his life is like. And these are weaponized kernels of truth that are doing this, but this guilt keeps her in the relationship longer. And then there's guilt for wanting independence, taking opportunities and creating space away from him. And his reactions taught her that independence was costly, and that means guilt became attached to autonomy. Going to work was not just going to work. So she feels guilty for doing those things. And this is where coercive control can really hijack normal daily routines. The guilt around this independence was a really big thing. And then the obligation that's attached to this one is you feel obligated to stay close to home. It's being framed as the caring choice. And then as well, like the autonomy, there's a fear. Independence could provide an escalation, and that's the overlap with this one. And up next, we have shame. And with shame in this story, shame was rooted in childhood blame. Lita's shame did not begin in this relationship. It had roots a long time ago. And she grew up with the message of, how could you let this happen? That kind of message trained her and trained people like her to interpret harm as a personal failure. Harm against you as being a personal failure. So when abuse appears later on in her life, that shame finds familiar ground pretty quickly. And the relationship didn't invent the shame, but it attached itself to an old wound here, and it really deepened it, which kept her in the relationship a bit longer. And then there was shame for being deceived. Lita thought she'd done a lot of work. So there's shame that goes along with doing all of this work and thinking that you're extremely self aware. And to admit these things to yourself, that you are going through abuse, that these things are happening when you think differently of yourself, it can also keep someone in the relationship longer because there's denial of what is actually going on. And then shame about staying and returning in everything that's going inside the relationship. It's isolating what is happening here in this relationship with Lita, and everything becomes layered. The physical violence, the animal abuse, put downs, financial control, the shame of not leaving becomes another layer of things that are going on. And all this layering makes it hard to disclose what's going on to others, hard to get support. It's harder to ask for help, which keeps you in this relationship longer. So that's fear, obligation, and guilt. And our 5 big goals for Lita going forward, and for others who've gone through the same thing going forward, is rebuilding trust in your perceptions, her perceptions, release responsibility for his behavior, heal the shame that has gone on. You survived everything. You did the best you could with what was going on. You're in survival mode, and it's hard to see things once you're in survival mode because you're just trying to get through the day, the hour, the minute, the second. Another goal we want for her is to reclaim her independence and stability, and then also build a life where peace is the baseline, not chaos. This is how she's lived in a lot of that her whole entire life. So we just want peace to be the actual baseline of how you are living. So Lita's story is really just about fear, obligation, guilt, and shame, and really how it reshaped her sense of what is possible. And her story is about that belief system and how that belief system was manipulated. And her story is about a really heavy trauma bond. And her story is about these built in excuses that this person's mental health gave them. And all these things together, coercive control could really take hold. And even if it's as violent as it was for Lita, it becomes very, very difficult to leave. And if you've gone through this or are going through the exact same thing, my heart goes out to all of you. And for those of you who are survivors that are listening to this that want to be a guest on our survivor story episodes, go to our website, narcissistapocalypse.com, click on the guest form button at the top of the page, read all our instructions there, and then send us an email. You can also send it to narcissistapocalypse@pm.me. And that's it for today's episode. I hope that you found this episode helpful, useful, and validating. And I hope you have a good night.